Good evening, everyone. We are waiting for Mr. Sudhakar Rao also to join us. I think he'll join us in a minute. Some last minute disturbance.
Very good evening to all of you. My apologies. Am I audible?
You are audible.
You are audible.
You are audible.
Thank you very much. My system got stuck up and therefore I could not start off on time. I'm joining from my mobile phone and please bear with me for these inadequacies. Ladies and gentlemen, very good evening to you and welcome to this webinar number 5 in the ICFAI's Wise Views Interactive Webinar Series. Today we have a very distinguished guest, s.Anu Acharya. A very good evening to s.Anu Acharya. She's been there for almost 10 minutes now, and my apologies to you too, s.Anu Acharya. We'll straight away get into this without any further ado. Today, we have this session starting now. We'll go on for about 30 minutes where the guest will deliver the talk for about 30 minutes on the session, Healthcare Innovation During the Pandemic, Opportunities and Challenges. After 30 minutes, we will have questions and answers moderated by Professor R. Prasad and I, and that will encompass all those questions asked by the audience at the time of registration, and also additional questions that might come up during the talk as well. Now, I would request s.Anu to start. Once again, apologies. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce briefly about s.Anu. She's an alumnus of IIT Kharagpur as well as University of Ohio at Chicago, and she has been a serial entrepreneur, columnist, poet, and a charismatic speaker. She has founded Optimum Biosolutions and then subsequently Mapmygenome, which is extremely popular. She is currently the founder and CEO of Mapmygenome. She is the one who has introduced the concept of personal genomics in India with the launch of Genome Patri in 2013. I'm very happy to share that she serves on the governing boards of National Institute of Biomedical Genomics, IIIT Hyderabad, and VHub. She's on the advisory board at Action for India and KIIT, on the board of mentors for IBCAP. She's a member of the CII's National Committee on Biotechnology, and also she's a committee member of HIMSS Asia Pacific India chapter. She has received numerous recognitions and awards. A few of them are Women Entrepreneur of the Year Award by Z Business, special recognition in the Leaders category by Indian Express, Pride of Telangana 2018 award, and also she received the Distinguished Alumnus Award from IIT Kharagpur, then Young Leaders Forum of British High Commission, Young Global Leader of World Economic Forum Class of 2011. With this introduction, ladies and gentlemen, we present you s.Anu Acharya. Over to s.Anu Acharya for your talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction, Professor Rao. I hope that I think this year with the pandemic, a lot more people are familiar with the kind of work that we do. So I thought that, while I can talk a lot about things that we've done over the last 20 years, I thought maybe focus a little bit about the areas of interest for the average, person who might be interested to know more about what healthcare has been able to do in the COVID front. So I thought that's what I would focus on today. Of course, I'm happy to share about all the other genomic pieces of what we've been doing so far. So, before I start, maybe I thought that it would be helpful to just give a little background in terms of how I got into the world of genomics and what we've been doing for the last 20 years. So about in the year 2000, once I'd moved back from the US, one of the areas that was fascinating at that time for me and also for the rest of the world was the fact that the human genome was getting sequenced for the first time in anybody's lifetime. Of course, at that point, the costs were tremendous. It was a few $1 billion. And then finally, I think It was done by multiple people across the globe, and it was pieced together little by little, and we were able to produce what we called as the reference genome that was created, which was basically like a consensus of all the efforts that was done. And if you had to think about it in a very simple way, it was more like if you had many humans all over the world, and they were all wearing a certain type of clothes, or most of them were wearing a certain types of clothes. You sort of, everybody was wearing, let's say, a black t-shirt or something like that. Then you are sort of created what we call as a consensus, which was the most common one, and that was created as what was the baseline for doing a lot of the work that we do in the genomic space. Of course, I've simplified it a lot because it's almost like 3.2 billion base pairs, and you're trying to find, each part of that genome is very significant in terms of information that gives you information on who you are, and why you look a certain way, or how you are, how you build, how your disease is, how you are prone to certain diseases, and so on. So I started in the year 2000. It was a fascinating time to be in the space of genomics. We believed that, at that point, that we could solve a lot of problems by being able to create world-class software from India in the space of genomics. Of course, I had no background in that area at all, and came from a background of physics, and I started in the space. So we built a team in India, and we also built a small team in the US as well. But over the years, we ended up doing a lot of interesting things with the company, where we acquired companies across the globe in Germany, in Netherlands, and in the US to be able to build one of the largest genomic services companies. And then about 7 years ago, I felt that there was a need that, the world was moving towards precision medicine, that you could now, what I mentioned, that cost a few $1 billion, your cost of that sequencing had come down quite dramatically. And I think as a result, I think this became something that was going to move more towards the average consumer, as well as towards the clinic and the patient. And that's how, I felt that there was a dearth in terms of the data that we had from India, and that we should do something in the direct to consumer space. So even though we were in the business of genomics, I think there was a strong need that I felt that, maybe we have to build the capability in India to be able to have enough data points from the Indian population, but also to be able to help people in terms of understanding disease, in terms of prevention, and also in terms of diagnosis. So that's how we got started as a company, and we've been doing this for now almost 20 years, first as in terms of contract research, but also now in the last 7 years working with several hospitals and consumers, as well as being able to work directly with corporates and others. So that's how what we've been doing so far. But I thought that today, maybe I thought, to spend a little bit of time, because I also like to, I believe that, if we can educate more people about, little information on genomics, it also helps in terms of understanding how you can build new business models in this space, because once you understand the science behind it, I think there are also ways of being able to build businesses around that as well. So I think by now everybody knows a lot about the virus, and I thought today's focus I will take as the virus, because I think as a company also, in terms of the changes that we made to our own business model, was to be able to incorporate a lot of work that we are doing on the COVID front as well, whether it was in terms of testing, whether it was in terms of sequencing of the genome as well. So basically, I think when you look at the the virus, it's about 30,000 base pairs, as opposed to the human genome, which is about 3.2 billion base pairs. So there is a huge difference in terms of the size, but this tiny little genome has created havoc around the world, as we all know. So basically, the virus structure that everybody is now very familiar with, has these protruding structures called the spike, and that's what is interesting in terms of a lot of development on terms of drugs and vaccines, as well as being able to understand mutations in that space also. But that's how it enters into our body, and how it's able to create multiple copies of itself and being able to then infect other cells, and then sort of in that process of replication and copying and all of that, just like humans make mistakes while copying, I think the virus also makes mistakes. Sometimes we may call it mistakes, sometimes it may be done in purpose to be able to basically evolve over a period of time, because that's how the race between the human and the virus will continue. And the virus is, the moment it mutates to a more interesting shape, it's able to get to a point where it can infect more people. So I think almost everybody must have done tests called RT-PCR, because this is what is the most common test, whether you have to go travel somewhere, whether it is if you're suspected of being infected by COVID or not. So a lot of times, I think what we found was that in the beginning of this pandemic, there were very few tests and the cost of these tests were very high. So the average test that RT-PCRs were in the range of was around 6,000 to 7,000 to 8,000 rupees, which is comparable to some of the testing that you could find in the US and others. Now, a lot of the ingredients that you would think about in terms of what was needed were all being imported at that point of time. What was interesting about this pandemic was that a lot of the supply chains were broken. And as a result, and also as a lot of thoughtful intervention by, whether it was the Department of Biotechnology and others, I think there was a sustained effort to see whether we could do a lot of this indigenously. And I think that sort of was what really created that whole business model of being able to do these tests at substantially lower costs, and thereby increasing the number of tests that can be done in a country like India. So that was one way of what you could see in terms of what you were seeing with the regular RT-PCR tests, where you are basically looking at different parts of this genome, and we are able to find ways of detecting it. And typically you would find 3 different areas to target, so that you are able to then build you are able to build with confidence that this is what you're finding over there. The other things that we found, of course, and I think we continue to find, is that a lot of times, especially in the times like this, it's very difficult to sort of build, to be able to do these complicated tests like RT-PCR. And therefore, we found that there are newer testing types that have emerged, and mostly over the last 1 year. Some tests were, of course, being done for other kind of diseases as well. So you found things like CRISPR, which was being used, which was initially the technology that was used for being able to find ways of editing the genome, and potentially has gone through a lot of ethical consideration, because you could potentially edit the sequence of a human genome and thereby change how humans will evolve in the future. And then there are tests like LAMP that are being created, where right now there is one test which is quite interesting, where you can actually do the entire test like an RT-PCR at home, unlike an antigen test, which is not equivalent to a PCR. So that's one of the other interesting areas that you will start seeing more of, where it's difficult to get a test done in maybe in a second tier, third tier city, or you're looking at times when the surge is so high that it's difficult to get appointments and so on. So I think what we have seen is that there's been an emergence in different types of tests that we are seeing over here. There's been an increased number of companies that have been created to be able to build a lot of these reagents and build a lot of devices in this space, because there are ways to be able to now do this a lot more cost effectively, being able to source a lot of materials locally, and being able to actually do it at prices that currently go at almost 1/10 of what we saw in the beginning of the pandemic. So that's a huge opportunity that exists today that is there. The other forms of tests, of course, that have come up are also what we call as the antibody testing, where you're testing to see if there was a presence of, an infection of past infection, or whether you've been vaccinated and the vaccination has been successful. And there are specialized forms of antibody tests that allow you to see if you can actually find ways of being able to do then what we call as a neutralizing antibody test as well. And that allows you to be able to see if, in terms of the effectiveness of the vaccine and so on. And also, I think there are many blood tests that go along with this. So you can see that, along with the regular RT-PCR testing, we also found that a large number of blood tests are prescribed, because sometimes some of these tests that have maybe a potential of lower sensitivity or wrong collection or anything else can be supplemented with other regular routine tests or inflammatory markers that will allow you to be able to fight it. So we saw that also increased quite significantly. Now, for the last 1 year, I think there was not much talk about genomes of the virus. I think except for the people that are involved in genomics, and the fact that many parts of the genome were used to build PCR-based tests. They're also used for building vaccines and drugs, but it was not something that the average person was very familiar with. Today, I think everybody knows many different variants that we talk about, whether it is the India variant, the Brazil variant, the UK variant, and so on. So this is, I thought would be helpful to see that if you are looking at something that is there when it comes to the viral genome, these are the 30,000, letters that are sort of stretched, if you could stretch it this way. And this part, which is the green part, which is the spike protein, is where a lot of things are interesting and therefore being used for both in terms of coming up with new PCR tests, or also in terms of coming up with different targets, but also an area where we are finding many interesting mutations that potentially can cause havoc, and maybe have been one of the reasons why we saw an emergence of a second wave as well. So I think that's sort of what has happened. I won't go into too much detail in terms of what is there, unless someone has a specific question. But these are sort of little bit in terms of how you would stretch that whole viral genome and be able to sequence that. So I think what is confusing for a lot of people is that it sounds very complicated names that are there, but actually it is quite simple, because if you look at any of these structures, when I said 30,000, every time you take 3 of these, that codes for an amino acid, and there are 20 essential amino acids and a couple more that are there. So all these are, so when you say N, which is an amino acid, G is glycine, and so on. So there are many different types of amino acids that we see. But the ones that are interesting, that we find are interesting, and what when you read in the newspaper, it might be difficult to sort of understand, is when you read mutation like E484K, and you are wondering what that is. But essentially it is that when you looked at the whole structure of the genome and you found the S protein, you found that at the position 484, and E was replaced by a K, which meant that your one of the amino acids is changed. So similarly, you find that in many of the other mutations as well. And in some cases, there is one that is a famous mutation, which is 6970, where you are basically seeing that 2 entire amino acids go away from that viral sequence, because 6 of those bases have gone away. And similarly, you might have some where you can find that more than that, there might be some insertion. So these are the kind of things that sort of create what we call as a mutation. And then ultimately, I think you're able to create, you'll find that a variant is basically one that has several mutations that are there in it. So the one that was probably the most famous was the UK variant, which is now present in a lot of pretty much many countries across the world. And you find that it has about, I think, 17 mutations or so. Similarly, I think there are other mutations that we see. And the one that we find that people call as the India mutation actually has 15 or 17, depending on who you're talking to. But it has some mutations that were common from what we found in the UK as well as the Brazil. Now, what is UK and South Africa. And what is interesting is that when you look at all of this and you look at build it up as a tree, you find that some of these are coming from the same set of starting point, but some of them actually can be found many times in different parts of the tree that is created. So you can actually find out how all of this originated, which basically means that you can ultimately have a way of being able to identify how the spread is happening and how you can build certain drugs and mitigation policies for that. So this is our lab, and you can see that everybody is all in PPEs. And basically, the main concepts of RT-PCR is such that you are basically able to detect those certain parts of the genome as well. Now, one more quick, maybe another thing, and this is something that we do on a regular basis, is that of being able to understand an entire genome and understand how the human genome, in this case, so not the virus, but how the virus as well as the host play an interesting aspect, and how your own genome is likely to play a role in terms of the immunity of this virus. So we build what we call as we created what we called as the genome patri immunity. And this was from the data of genomes of consumers that already were our customers. And we were able to build some interesting aspects that were very helpful for these consumers. So we looked at data that would allow us to be able to understand the SARS-CoV, the previous SARS susceptibility, look at things like the cytokine storm, which is essentially your own immune system going into overdrive. And you're looking at things like your comorbidities, like diabetes and others, because in the end, I think whether it is your drugs, whether it is your own diabetes, I think a lot of times that has a big role to play in terms of how you interact with the disease, as well as the nutrients like vitamin C, zinc, and others. So this is where we believe that. So when I was talking about a lot of what happens in the genome of the virus, I think you can also think that, in a much bigger, broader sense, you sort of build that also in terms of what is there from a human perspective. And there are certain genes that are involved in a lot of the whether it is in terms of understanding of your cytokine storm or understanding the severity of disease. And we are able to find those mutations that will likely to be able to have a direct impact in terms of how you are likely to react to COVID in the first place. So that's one area of what we find that this can be very helpful to understand if you were ever infected with this virus, are you likely to have a more severe reaction or not, or likely to have a cytokine storm, and therefore should be prepared in terms of what kind of drugs you're likely to be able to, what might work for you and what might not work for you. And similarly, I think, you can understand the risk for certain types of diseases and see if, for instance, I think a lot of times people are given steroids, but if you already had a risk for diabetes or you had diabetes, that's likely to be able to shoot that up fairly high, and that can be a potential problem. So those kind of things that you can understand in terms of both understanding risk, in terms of understanding how your comorbidities as well as your compromised immune systems, which are interesting from multiple different angles, because it also has been shown that a lot of times people's compromised immune systems can create even more mutations from a virus perspective and so on. Similarly, I think there are many drugs that were used, and I think some of them, and I think I should have updated a little bit in terms of what drugs I have put over here, but a lot of new drugs have come up. But a lot of times you find that many of them have a genetic component to the drugs that are there. So some drugs work well for you, some drugs don't work well for you, both in terms of efficacy, but also in terms of toxicity. So if you look at a lot of whether it's antivirals, whether you're looking at steroids, whether you're looking at, things like your drugs for pain or many other things, all of them have, or a large majority of them have what we call as a mutation or genotype that is likely to make it more effective or less. So that has become also a huge area of where genomics has been able to branch out, and it's called pharmacogenomics and has been used very successfully across the world in several diseases, notably like cancer and a few others that have been used regularly. And similarly, I think there is, nutrient stores and so on. But like I mentioned earlier, I think very quickly, and I'd like to, close it in 30 minutes as promised, that when you look at sequencing of the genome, you can find that you will be able to understand it both in terms of whether the tests that you're doing are valid. And one interesting thing to note was that a lot of times, I think when the UK variant was found out early enough, it was because one of the areas of the RT-PCR test was found to be negative and the others were found positive. And that's how we found very quickly that that particular type of variation was occurring, and therefore people were testing negative for S and not for the other types. So I think you can find that the value of genomics is huge because it is being used for finding new drug targets. It's also been used for vaccine development. I think notably, that we found a lot of new types of vaccines that came up this year. This time, I think the Pfizer and Moderna were probably the most well-known, which use the mRNA concepts and so on. So again, very quickly, these are the kind of drugs that we saw. And a lot of these drugs that are there will have a component that is interesting to understand from a genomics perspective to be able to see that it's going to work for them or not. And similarly, I think whether it comes for repurposing drugs, you look at the genomics and you look at how that is going to help you in terms of building those for specific types of new things as well. And the last slide that I wanted to maybe quickly bring up is that we found that there are many vaccines for COVID, and the ones that are probably more interesting from a genomics point of view are the DNA vaccine. That is the one that Zydus is going to introduce, which will carry a gene of interest, and that basically uses a plasmid, and you're able to then create that response. And the two that are already approved by the US FDA are the Moderna and Pfizer, and have been widely used across the world, are where you use this little mRNA, and that allows you to be able to build the antibody response as well as the other immune systems areas like T cells and B cells to be able to build the right kind of defense mechanism for an individual. So that's sort of a little bit in terms of what you would see in terms of looking at genomic ways of being able to come up with new vaccines. But that from a business point of view, I think what we saw was that a lot of new companies that came up, many of them which were pharma companies, I think built up capabilities in vaccines. And also a lot of new older drugs were found to be repurposed to be able to look at a pandemic, to be able to look at COVID response. So I think that has been an interesting thing, that when you look at it from what has happened over the last 1 year. But the other interesting areas, and I haven't talked about it in great amount of detail, which have been totally transformed over the last 1 year, have been the entire use of tele-consulting as a platform. I think it was the first time that I think almost everybody used teleconsult for talking to a doctor, because you couldn't actually go visit. We found like a large number of apps that came up that would allow you to be able to, whether it was in terms of using some of these apps to understand what to do when you had COVID, or if you were able to do home isolation and so on. So I think what the pandemic has done has been able to accelerate by 5 to 10 years a lot of things that people would have taken normally. And also with that might have been difficult in terms of behavior change, but I think that's what it did in terms of the changes in behavior from the average consumer, but also from a healthcare professional. And the third area that I believe that it has done is that people have really started to take health as being something that is not just something that you go when you have a problem. I think what we will see in terms of changes in behavior is going to be that people will start looking at health as being an important and the most important part of what life is all about. So I think that's, with that, I think, I would like to maybe move over to the Q&A, I think, so that we can actually get questions that people would like an answer to. I hope that that was somewhat interesting for people, over here, but I'm happy to take questions as they come along.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Anu. I think that's a highly informative session. One, because it is relevant and it talks about the theory and the background around the current day problems, and the other because it puts everything in the right perspective and becomes the foundation for our Q&A from now on. So thank you very much for this session. Thank you for putting together so much of information in a manner that we can easily digest. I think this will go on as a good reading material for us or for anyone interested in understanding what is the brief background about reading into the COVID testing as well as sequencing. Thank you. And now I would like to welcome Professor R. Prasad, who is the Director for Academic Wing at ICFAI Group. Professor R. Prasad is the architect of our online MBA program, and he has 3 decades of experience which combines corporate experience as well as experience in academics. He has published several papers. He is the architect of this program, as I said. He serves as professor and mentor of online MBA program too. And he is an alumnus of IIT Bombay and IIM Kolkata. I now welcome Professor R. Prasad to start the moderation of this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Indeed, you were able to start off by centering this around the emotions and queries which are largely driven by the current situation. And I think there are a lot of questions in this which are associated with that. There are other questions as well. So what we have tried to do is we have tried to aggregate it for common benefit. So the responses are beneficial to all without making it too specific. So the first cluster that I'd like to take up is about your product, your venture, the enterprise, and there are some questions from that because I think this is a new area, and from those who have been watching the presentation also, there is certain specialization, certain technicality about the particular area, and to that extent, it's also far more interesting to Indians. From a normal business, it calls for a certain level of background. So I'll start with your venture, ma'am. Your company started in a niche area, and you believe that it had good potential in preventive healthcare. So broadly, we are trying to understand the challenges you faced and how you faced them. For instance, when you had the Mapmygenome venture itself, what were the challenges that you faced in the diffusion of your innovation? I mean, it would have taken time for people to understand, etc. And how did you pass through those stages? What are the challenges you faced, and how did you discover the pricing, or is it still discovered?
I think that's a great question. I think so. We started in the year 2013 when we first introduced Genome Patri, which is our product. And in the beginning, obviously, I think it was expected that people will take time to understand. And I think there were 2-3 pieces of the problem, and we were aware of the 3 problems that we had to tackle. The first and foremost was the fact that, while it was, it was a niche product, we had to clearly understand, one, what pricing will work for us and what pricing will work for the consumer. But 2 is that also at that point of time, there wasn't enough Indian data that was there. So, people would constantly be, at least the scientists in the community, I think, were able to understand that, there was less amount of data that was there. And that was also our challenge that we were trying to solve. And the second was that, we had to build awareness. It was not something that was normal for us to be able to say that, you try to find out something about yourself that are likely to make a difference in many years later. I think a lot of India was more fatalistic and said, we prefer that when it comes, we'll deal with it and so on. I think what the pandemic did this year, which we took a long time to get to, was that to realize that in the end, your own immune system is very important to understand, and it takes a while for you to build up that immunity. But I think for us to be able to spread that knowledge in the consumer, we went through process of 3-4 things, right? The first was we didn't raise that kind of money to sort of splash it all over the country at once. And I didn't think that was very useful also, because a lot of times people tend to do that, and it backfires, because I think you need to make sure that one, the people who are trusted, in this case, medical professionals, that they are okay with it, and that goes, you have to do it slowly. That was one part. The second part was to be able to find, who are your the right influencers, if you will, right? In terms of who are the first few people who are likely to be early adopters, because you are trying to introduce a concept. And the third was to be able to also, for us, that we improve our product in a way so that it's ready for prime time. Right? That I would consider that it takes a while to be able to get to that point. So I think because for me also, while we were in genomics and we understood the technical part of this whole process, I think what we had to also understand was consumer behavior. So I think there were these were the challenges that we had to sort of go through. And what we did was that in order to sort of bring that concept into people's mind, what we did was to be able to find something that we felt people were sort of familiar. Because in the end, I think you can't suddenly introduce a new concept that people don't have any connection with. And that's why, even with a lot of resistance from my co-founder, I named the product Genome Patri, because I felt that at least people knew what Janam Patri was. And a Janam Patri will help you in terms of understanding, what you should eat, what your partner is likely to be, and so on and so forth, right? I mean, so I think we sort of said that people understand what it's supposed to do, and therefore we were able to do something that was able to get to that. But that helps to a certain extent. I think it gets you to a point where people, at least the people who read a lot of the media and others, are able to understand, and therefore you discover your segment of population that sort of helps you in building that over a long period of time. But I think for us, ultimately, it was about initially a slow way of being able to diffuse that knowledge, whether it was in the medical community or otherwise. And I think now we have been able to work with several large hospitals. We work directly with, people come to our website. We also work with corporates and others. But I would say that, it took its own time to be able to get there. Maybe if you would have splashed it in year 4 or 5, it would have helped in terms of just, spending on advertising, but I'm not so sure. I think it's good that, it happened more organically in some ways. I guess the inorganic part came from the pandemic.
Thank you, ma'am. I think for a product of or a service of this type, the points you made have been very insightful for those who want to consider such propositions. The next question is slightly associated. Given that India is a country with a large number of poor and middle class people who cannot afford even a routine medical checkup or care, the bottom of the pyramid market is where a product like this can make a huge social benefit. What do you suggest as a solution for this in a country like India, where the cost, of course, when you begin is high, but how do you optimize?
I think there's one big problem, and I'd like to, I mentioned how RT-PCR in India was brought down this year. I think part of it was driven by need. There was a need from from the country perspective, right? There was a need in terms, the demand was huge. And I think as a result of that, I think a lot more businesses saw opportunity in terms of coming up with own reagents and so on. I think one problem we face in the world of genomics has been that, especially when you're doing large scale sequencing and all of that, is that you still are dependent a lot in terms of some of the global giants who are supplying these reagents as well as the equipment. And as a result, I think because of all the customs and all kinds of duties, I think the cost of a product here is actually higher than what it costs when you are in the US or otherwise, which is actually a sad thing, because in India you want it to be cheaper. So I think two ways that this will happen. One is that it's naturally happening, that a lot of global competition is bringing down the pricing. But the second is that there is a need, but there needs to be a demand also from the India perspective, because India is a very small market when it comes to the whole genomic information. So I think that's the challenge, that how do we, it's a chicken and egg situation. And I think in RT-PCR it was broken by the pandemic. Here also we are finding a value in terms of genomics. And I think the viral sequencing, for instance, is one of the areas that I think is brought about a little bit more of the limelight when it comes to the obstacles that are there in this space. So I think it will happen. But the two areas that I believe that if there's a possibility, clearly the national government has been ensuring a lot of the people that they're the bottom of the pyramid. And if there's a possibility to show the right kind of ROI in that, I think maybe there's a possibility to be able to generate that demand as well. So I think it has to be something that if you want to really build it up to scale, it has to be in partnership with somebody who can potentially fund a large portion of that. And the other way, of course, is to be able to find a way to fund it yourself in some form, whether with the VC or otherwise, and be able to build that scale in the market so that it spurs that demand that is currently growing, but growing very organically.
Thank you, ma'am, for sharing the concerns and the constraints in the journey till now. An associated question would be, to get you to the place that you are right now, given all this, what are the principles of financing that you used so that you remained, you didn't go overboard, you were able to do what you wanted to do?
So I think, I have, in my previous company, we raised 2 rounds of funding. And I think, funding is a double-edged sword, right? If it is okay if it is a short-term need, if it is something that you need over a long-term basis, then it can be a little challenging. So I think what happens is, especially when you are in a space like genomics, it becomes if you can't build models to sustain yourself, I think the funding can actually be a deterrent, because you sort of realize that if you take on debt, then that can become a problem. If you take on equity, then you don't deliver the right kind of the revenue multipliers, then that becomes a challenge. So I think there are 2 things. Now, anyway, we are a profitable company, so it's not too much of a, we don't have that constraint right now. So if we need capital, it will be to expand in certain cities and other places. But for a long time, I think we were very careful. We kept it lean as lean as possible, because I guess we learned from the mistakes of the past, where we spent money on equipment, and equipment became very quickly obsolete and so on. So I think that was the learnings that we had from the previous experience. And this time, in the beginning, we didn't invest in buying too much equipment. I think over a period of time we did, as our demand grew. I think we were constantly checking whether doing it in-house was better than outsourcing. And ultimately, I think we did move everything in-house, but it took us a few years to be able to get there. And I think it's important to do that so that you understand, one, you've been able to build the right business model, and 2, you take money when you need to expand, and not as something that to prove a business model, I would say. So I think that was the principle that we used, and we were careful about how we spent our money. And I think that has been very helpful for us in this journey, because as we went along, I think even when we looked at expanding into COVID and other things, I think we pretty much used a lot of the similar concepts and thoughts that we have to make sure that we can build efficiency into the system and be as make sure that quality is there, because in the end, if you don't have quality, people won't come back. Because I think in this case, I think it was also that we had experience that most other labs would not have, because this was something that we have done for 20 years. We know all the challenges of RT-PCR also. I think that was hugely beneficial for us. So I think those are some of the basic principles we used in terms of how we did this. And we also, I think in some ways, thought a little bit ahead of others, because we reached out to the airports and others before people even thought that that could be a potential area that you would need to be able to develop. And we also worked on coming up with pooling mechanisms. We worked on doing things that were at the intersection of doing large scale sero surveys and all of that. So I think all that helped, because I think we come from a scientific background, and it allowed us to be able to build that out business in a little bit more meaningful manner, and not as an opportunistic base entirely, but to be able to build it on science and also to build it on principles, on the mistakes that we have done in the past as well. So I hope that answered your question in a roundabout way.
Yeah, absolutely, ma'am. I think, it is very interesting to know about lean and the financial prudence that you've maintained, because most importantly, you're here to speak about the journey ahead. And many times in entrepreneurship, we try so many ideas, and then the people go overboard, and then they're not there. Well, the idea would have been fantastic. Thanks a lot, ma'am. We move to the next question, cluster of questions, which are basically related to the opportunities and challenges which have come up in this particular period. And to take this on and to give us a different view of looking at questions, I'd invite Mr. Sudhakar to take on these question part.
Thank you, Professor Prasad. Ma'am, your responses have been very, very useful all the while. So I would like to draw your attention towards the opportunities and challenges in the healthcare sector. As you know, healthcare is a vast landscape, starting from hospitals to devices to trials to outsourcing, telemedicine, insurance, equipment, so on and so forth. The Indian healthcare sector, which is currently at 194 billion US dollars, is poised to grow to about 372 billion US dollars by 2022. So this is roughly about 2 times it is poised to grow in a matter of, say, 2.5 to 3 years. Now, as of early this year, as of February, an estimate of 420 e-hospitals were established across India as part of the Digital India initiative. Now, under this background, the first question is, in the current scenario, the scenario which has changed quite drastically from March onwards, what are the areas of growth that you would expect in the healthcare sector?
So I think one, I'm assuming that this will eventually taper off in some form, right? I mean, at least that's the hope, that we won't constantly be under a COVID, cloud, if I would say that. But I think what I believe would, what you'll see in terms of growth would be in areas of prevention, and areas where the consumer has a little bit more access to information about their own health and health records, because I think that's valuable from a consumer's perspective. And I think one big challenge has always been that today, if you go to one hospital, you get a lot of a small amount of information that you get, which is hard to then transfer on to others. And even though there have been a lot of companies that came up with EMRs and other things, I think there have always been challenges in terms of how to do it. And I think that will hopefully sort out in the next couple of years or so. So we'll see a little bit more on that. But I think more interestingly would be where people will be able to understand dynamics over a period of time, and not just have to, not believe in, going once to see a doctor. The other thing I think that would be interesting also would be that we'll see a lot more devices that people will use at home. There was the first use of the antigen test that was used in RT-PCR. Instead of of course, that has its own limitations, but I think there are more like that you can now do everything at, in a single use. So you'll start seeing more of like single use testing, both in terms of not just pathogen and viral and all of that, but I think something that will come to the customer rather than go away from it. So less dependence on hospitals and less dependence on infrastructure wise models, because I think if people have learned one thing from the pandemic, it is that if you were healthier, then you probably were able to survive this better than otherwise. The other form of healthcare innovations that we'll see will also, like I mentioned, that some of the things that were done with very huge, even things like X-rays and other things. A lot of those things will be miniaturized, and we already started seeing some of that, whether it was in the watch or others. But some things will become now much more present across to everybody, and also to small clinics and hospitals and doctors. So you'll see more of, while we might see more some large hospitals come up, I think what will happen is that every doctor will have more small equipment, but effective equipment in terms of how they want to tackle their own healthcare problems as well, and the consumer being more, much more, given the tools to be able to manage on their own. So I think those would be in very brief some of the trends. There are of course many other things that will come up in terms of coming up with new drugs, new vaccines, and all of that, which I think now that we have seen newer technologies that have come up, I think we'll see that will start being used more effectively. And I think when it comes to vaccines and other areas, what we will see is to plan for the future, right? So not just come up with something when you need it, but to be able to come up with a variety of different possible ways of being able to mitigate than what you did now. And I think the current pandemic has sort of pushed us in thinking from outside of the box of where we were.
Thank you, ma'am. I think you have mapped the areas of growth which will spin into new areas of innovation. COVID has actually triggered several innovations, and as a common man, what we see or what we hear is about, in India at least, is the DRDO's 2DG, which is the latest one. My lab's Coviself, which we've been seeing over the last 24 or 48 hours. Now, in outside India, we have seen the tests itself, as you have mentioned, tests itself are going to be an innovative area where large number of companies, if not in India, abroad, they're going to innovate and come up with low cost, low priced testing for large scale applications, especially Sorrentino Pharma that we hear about, and also the Finder test, the PCR test of Finder from Davies, North Carolina based organization. Now, the innovations that we see in India, what are the opportunities for sustainable innovation on account of COVID? I have noted that you mentioned this is not just because of COVID, but we have to be prepared as a healthcare matured market. But on account of COVID, what are the sustainable innovations that are possible, or the opportunities that you see in India?
So I think a lot of the the AI-based models. So for instance, right now, I think while it could have been done because you collected more data compared to the past, I think we saw some of the innovations in AI that came mostly in radiology and other places because you had access to that data. I think what you'll see is also that because we now have a lot more online consults, you have a lot more possibilities of being able to get more trackers and other things. You'll also find that there will be a sustainable use of being able to use that data in different formats for, both in terms of coming up with newer devices, but also in terms of coming up with ways of managing care for consumers as well as for doctors. So then I mentioned that you'll see that more of the doctors will be more self-sufficient. I think for right now, I think we find that most of the time, most doctors will send out a lot of tests across, to different labs and others. I think there'll be a little bit more self-sufficiency in that doctor's office, because there are many more newer devices that are coming up that allow your doctor to be able to do it right on the spot. So for instance, I think, we have been using, for instance, the Abbott ID now for COVID detection, for instance, right? But that same machine can be used for, many other forms of being able to detect. Normally, those tests would have been sent out to a lab to be able to do it. But if the doctor can immediately do it right then, I think you will see that, more doctors will have access. And right now, I think because of COVID, people bought these kind of machines. But I think these machines will find use over the next few years as well. So I think that's one kind of thing that we will see. The second kind of thing will be all in terms of how we consult and how we access information. I think that has changed, I think, for the better. And the third, of course, will be that because now genomics, and let me put in a little bit plug of what we do, is to be able to put, use that genomic information in terms of how you look at certain drugs and how you prescribe. I think that information will also be available to both doctors as well as consumers as well. So I think those kind of things will start soon.
Very, very interesting, ma'am. Thank you very much. In this context, we have increased concerns of safety, especially safety of children, safety of healthcare workers, and also staffs in various organizations. What kind of innovation is needed to address these concerns?
So I think one has been that, when you look at, we've been working with several corporates, for instance, to be able to do large scale testing. But large scale testing might be a little impossible when you're doing, when you have to do it pretty much every week, every 2 weeks or so. But there have been many interesting innovations, and we work with, we are currently trying to work with one of the, with one group that is doing interesting pooling that will allow you to be able to do, scan large campuses and be able to do testing for many people at once and at a very reasonable cost. So I think those are the kind of innovations that help in terms of saying, how do we look at safety of large number of people at once? And because these new pooling mechanisms have come up, and it will be useful not just for this, I think can be used for other things as well. So while a lot of, like I said, a lot of innovations came up because of COVID, I think the same innovations can be used for other diseases types as well. Similarly, I think, there have been newer ways of coming up with like ventilators, some failed models, but some successful. But I think all those attempts, I think, is going to spur a lot of people moving from some other disciplines like engineering and other areas into healthcare. And I think that will basically mean that you will get better quality of people that will be looking at the same problem from a different angle. And I think that will spur, better forms of innovation in healthcare. And one area that healthcare has been a little bit behind, or actually quite behind, has been in terms of how we aggregate a lot of the data and all of that. And I think because now I think almost every engineer in the country, and also pretty much every discipline has seen an interest in healthcare. I think it will bring that cross-disciplinary thinking, will bring many more changes that maybe we still don't know what those are going to be. But that's what I'm hopeful about, that it has at least brought the attention in the right space. And we'll see a lot more happening, whether it is in terms of devices, whether it's in terms of data, whether it is in terms of the way treatment is done in the first place at all. So hope that answered some.
Yes, it does. Anything specific about the concerns of safety for children? Is there anything coming up in that area?
So I would. So I think that when it's coming for safety, as in from diseases or from
The COVID concerns us.
Correct. So I think, a lot of those are coming up because of two reasons. I think some reasons are reasons that we all know, that is, the more people getting together, I think, has spread the virus, and therefore the mutations, and which is why I was talking a lot about the mutations, because in the end, I think the more number of people get infected, the more chances there are of mutations. And then that's where we are seeing that a lot of, with the new variations that we are seeing in the virus, we are seeing that a lot of the children have also been affected, which we didn't see in the first wave. And I think that's a little, I think it's quite scary because, I think most for, you don't know how to, they can't be vaccinated. They are not, you're not able to do that. So the only way of changing that is to, prevent as many of the other people that you can vaccinate. So one, I think in the US, at least, they are looking at vaccinating people from children from 12 years also. So maybe that will, that needs to be coming up in India as well. But I think we are still a little far away because we haven't finished our 45 plus as well. So I think, but the possibility is that because now we have vaccines that are safe for children to be used, whether it's Pfizer or others that have been used in populations outside of India. I think that's good news that you can use it to vaccinate. But the other is that at least if you can't vaccinate that segment of population, if you can vaccinate the larger segment that is there, other than that, I think that is good enough. So, but we have to do that faster. So that is one. The second is to be able to look at drugs and make sure that, India has a lot of possibilities of manufacturing drugs. We are the drug capital of the world, and we are the vaccine capital of the world. So I think this should be a, one wake-up lesson that, the reason why we were not able to create as much supply was that, some components came from outside of India. So I think one is to be able to make sure, just like we plugged in holes in one part of the problem, I think we need to plug those holes in other areas as well. So to be able to make sure that all the pieces are available in India also, because I think when it becomes something like this, people become very selfish. I think countries become selfish, even though it doesn't really help because, unless the whole world is safe, you are not safe. But that's the truth. So I think one is to be able to build competency in not just, building some parts of the ecosystem in locally, but also to be able to do that, when it requires any physical component. I think that's the more important piece, that every piece has to be here to be able to make that happen. Otherwise, it becomes hard. So other than that, I think from a children's safety perspective, I guess, the regular things, whether it is masking or otherwise, have to continue to be done until we have vaccinated at least 50%, 60% of the population.
Great. One last question in this opportunities and challenges segment is, what is the potential for outpatient healthcare in this context that you see?
So I think one area that really suffered was most of the regular things in healthcare actually suffered tremendously, except for things that you could do a teleconsult, right? And what I believe, and I remember seeing this in one or two instances, was that there are ways to be able to do an effective teleconsult if you had the right equipment for the patient as well. So if there are possibilities of being able to test a patient with low-cost devices, and then do a consult with the doctor, I think that becomes very effective. I think currently the kind of equipment that you have for getting, let's say, a second opinion from someone in the US, you go to a center which is doing all these measurements on the patient, and therefore the doctor on the other end is doing it. But that's an expensive proposition. I think when we are looking at a country like India, we need to build low-cost innovations that will allow us to be able to do these regular testing. By testing, I mean, when you're inspecting a patient, to be able to do that at the comfort of their home, but to be able to have that access to that information, to that equipment, so that the doctor will be able to see them. They can be anywhere in the world, but they can still be able to talk to them, but with the right kind of lens, if I will. Because otherwise, I think if you're looking at it blind, it becomes hard because not everyone knows how to diagnose. So there are a few ways of being able to do that that we have seen in the past, whether it was the EMRs where they ask you questions and they pinpoint, they put in diagrams. There is an interesting way of being able to help them through that process, but some of it might have to be devices in the future.
Very, very interesting, ma'am. I think in the area of opportunities and challenges, the innovations that are bound to happen are around the devices and the diagnostics in terms of the tests that can, one, repurpose the existing innovations and apply to various other purposes. And also, it is proliferating what is called a participative management of healthcare from both sides of the table. I think a lot of boundaries are getting blurred now with the COVID accelerated innovations and the different way of thinking in itself in the landscape of healthcare. I think your detailed response to this thing gives us a lot of promise that anybody pursuing careers in healthcare is bound to actually do extremely well, and not just in terms of ROIs, or not just in terms of career progress, but in terms of being able to touch several lives in India and across the world. Thank you very much. And now I hand over to Professor Prasad for the next dimension of questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Your responses have been fairly detailed, and therefore, it is very, very understandable. And to that extent, it covers some of the other questions as well. We have another 3 clusters of questions. So what I'm trying to do is I earlier aggregated a few in a cluster. Now I'll try and combine it so that, we are able to finish off in time. Meanwhile, we also have members who have posted it on the chat. I'm trying to aggregate that. So if somebody has another query, I suggest that you put it on the chat. We may not be able to handle 100%, but certainly we'll be able to handle 90%. So this series is about the healthcare communication and behavior. This cluster is about healthcare communication and behavior. There seems to be a huge communication challenge from many sides, and many people seem to have aggravated it. It starts from the state, it goes to healthcare practitioners, scientists, it goes to the common man, it goes to social media, and there is a big amount of what I may call suspicion, lack of trust, transparency, literacy. Literacy is a big challenge in India, so people believe a lot of things which are told to them. Then social media does not help this in particular. There are also fears of deliberate manipulations. So in this particular context, healthcare communication and behavior is something that we'd like to focus on. So what is your advice to healthcare professionals in the area of to communicate better, to communicate more professionally? What would be your advice? What are your suggestions?
So I think that, I found that this time a lot of the doctors actually rose to that occasion. I mean, if I look at some examples, I think if you go to Twitter, there are some doctors that actually really rose to that occasion, and I think I follow them also for whether it is understanding of the black fungus or anything else. But there are a few that I know that I can trust, because I guess I have enough knowledge in this space to be able to figure out which one I can follow and who I shouldn't follow. But you're absolutely right. I think there has been so much misinformation, starting from saying people saying things like you can put cow dung and or roll in mud and save yourself from corona, to eating papad and all kinds of things. And some of these are coming from leaders, and some of these are coming from other people. And plus, I think there have also been some cases where we've seen that doctors are over prescribing drugs, and part of it is, I think, comes from lack of knowledge of infectious diseases. Right now, I think the problem is every doctor has had to step up, right? Because everybody is, in fact, even, I get so many questions, and I'm not even a medical doctor, right? But I get questions on a lot of different drugs and other things. But at least I do a deep dive in terms of many times to be able to understand it myself before I can tell something to someone. But I think when you are when you're a frontline worker and you are in the hospital or you're a doctor, I think sometimes they have not been educated themselves on some of these areas. And I think it's a little sad that some they are having to do this because there's just a lack of knowledge of that from an infectious disease perspective. So I think one is that we need to make sure that the voice of scientists and the voice of people is amplified. There are some fantastic people in the country, but I think they don't get as much amplified as people that maybe shouldn't be amplified. And I think part of that problem is also one poor type of information available on media, especially on television, which is what is available and in vernacular languages. And I think that quality needs to be far better. But more importantly, I think when it comes to managing it from, managing 1.2 billion people, how do you do it when you don't have, a streamlined community to be able to disperse that information? And it's also, this time I think it was also that when we started off, nobody knew, right? It was very few people had the knowledge to be able to say with certainty. But I think the plan should always be to be able to find the people who are knowledgeable in this space. And I remember I had started writing a whole series of articles on our website because I felt that there was something that maybe I could add because I've been in the space of genomics and therefore be able to help people understand this a little bit more. And I tried to write it in a language that was hopefully understandable by more people. And what I found was that I would send this out to many medical doctors as well. And initially I thought I'll get brickbats for doing something like this. But I found that many times they were coming back to me saying, can you write more about these topics and so on. So I think one is that maybe some of I know many doctors that got up and have been on television and other things. But I think we should also see a lot of the molecular biologists and simplify that knowledge so that people can understand. And when people understand, I think it's usually, people try to take things that they can understand better. So when you say that, a certain kind of misinformation spreads, it's because they're familiar with that information. And therefore, it's easier for them to sort of propagate that because that's what they currently understand. So that's where I believe that, communication is key, but I think we have done a very bad job at that, both from, whether it was in terms of, everywhere. So I think that definitely needs, I think has huge room for improvement. And whatever we can do a little bit, we've tried to do, but I think there is much more to be done.
Thanks, ma'am. It's a very emotive issue. Fear is running rampant. So building upon that question, you have mentioned about writing on the website. What do you think large organizations, organizations can do to aid in this effort so that it reaches out to the common man?
So I think, actually there's a lot of good information available across on the internet. The problem is who does that sieving of that information and dispersing of that information. I think that needs to be done. So for instance, I know that even when it comes to drugs, and I think that has become almost all of us, and I'm sure that everybody here would have got requests for remdesivir, for 2D, for all kinds of things. Right? Now the problem is, I know from a lot of the doctors that you shouldn't be taking a lot of these drugs until a certain point of time. But people are so desperate right now that they believe that they want to do something. And I think that sort of misinformation can be very horrible because, and I think that's what is starting off the second epidemic, which was on the black fungus, for instance. But it's hard because you're doing it one by one, right? You're getting to communicate it to whoever is asking you to do that. So that information, I think, needs to be done on a scale that, long time back, I think, when we had only Doordarshan, it was probably easier to communicate messages across because all of us saw the same thing. The problem is today, I think we have so many different channels to see that, if you want corporates to be able to, amplify that message, I think that is being done by some of the lobbies, whether it is NASCOM or FICCI or CII, but those need to be made that same message needs to be replayed many times for it to become effective. And that's what someone told me once, that only when a message starts getting boring is when you know that it has started to hit the public. So I think that's what we need to do. The second is that, if we can do, for instance, like how many years ago we did, small songs, whether it was Ek Titli, Anek Titli, or something like that, which became a national movement. I think we need to do something like that to educate people, because we have to reach out to the lowest common denominator. And I think we are not doing that right now. We are very much focused in terms of who we are reaching out to. And so I think the role of the lobbies is important, the role of corporates, but I think the more important will be the role of musicians and artists and poets to be able to communicate this, to get that with the right messaging, which will reach the average consumer.
Thank you, ma'am. You have summed it neatly. There is a lot of scope for innovation in the area of communication. And I hope, some of those listening in, because, as an institution, our emphasis is how to view this from the lens of an entrepreneurship, leadership, managerial lens, so that, there is far more opportunity in the world outside to take this ahead. So with this, I'll hand it back to Mr. Sudhakar for the next section.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, ma'am. There are a lot of popular and controversial questions appearing on the screen. I'll keep that towards the end, and let me finish the one on the trends section. What are the trends that you see now in the area of care as opposed to cure? For example, how does nursing care evolve according to you?
So I think nursing care will become an important aspect of what, so far again, most of this care has always been either for, in terms of, for a particular problem, right? That was one thing that we dealt with. The second was that there were certain homes that were focused on regular care. And I think we'll see more of that as well, where you can start seeing a proactive way of being able to look at the whole nursing and the care section in the first place, because they have also started to understand the value of what this is going to be about. So I think giving them the right tools, not just the medical doctors, but also the other professionals like nurses and other paramedics and others, who have to have at least enough knowledge to be able to take care of a lot of the people that they are in touch with, because we don't have as many, you can't depend entirely on the doctor. I think in the US, for instance, not that that's the best model of doing it, but a lot of the nurses are given a free hand in terms of how they care for patients. And I think, maybe we need to give a little bit more empowerment to a lot of the other health professionals that are dealing with, patients, in terms of both giving them the right educational material, but also making sure that they have the right tools and decision-making ways of being able to manage them.
Great. So empowering the paramedical staff, especially nurses, would go a great long way to improving the overall care as a segment for us. Thank you very much, ma'am. These days, we notice that the government, several governments do that, but in India also government seems to be planning to prove that it is spending on healthcare. What do you think are the most pragmatic way of improving its investments in healthcare to maximize impact for government?
I think one is that we need to really, enable entrepreneurship in this space. And I think, currently, I think there are several kinks in the whole process in terms of how you want to get, price controls is one of them. And I think those sound good from a short-term perspective, but I think in the long term, I think that actually ends up becoming a little bit of a challenge, both in terms of quality and perceived quality, and also in terms of, how people will be interested in that space in the first place, right? So that would be one thing I think has to be thought through a little bit more carefully from a government's perspective. The second thing is that there needs to be standards for quality. So I think today we still look at US FDA and a lot of these other things that are done, which are done in markets outside of India. I think if we had a very strong, you know, quality standards perspective, like a NIST in the US or otherwise, that would be very helpful to be able to build some institutions that will help in building trust and quality in the country from a healthcare perspective. And the second thing would be to strengthen the regulatory perspective. And this would what I would consider as more as infrastructure based problems that we can solve. The second, like I mentioned, the price controls and others, because I think that will drive more innovation if we can build ways of being able to allow more people to do it. Because in the end, I think if you have enough demand, the market will automatically come up with the right model. Except in the case, in pandemics or something else, we can figure out a short-term thing, but have a long-term view of how we're going to get people to be more innovative. The third is that, while the whole, ensuring of people in terms of the payers that we have, I think that's an area that needs to be developed much better, because so far, while the government has taken the first few steps, I think we are still far behind in terms of how insurance is done in India, both in terms of chronic care as well as in terms of regular this thing. I think that needs to be strengthened. So the government can look at it from one point of view, but the other. But I think the most important part is going to be in spending on education, in building more and better quality educational systems we have, both in terms of getting out more doctors, larger, better quality doctors, but also other healthcare professionals, whether it is in terms of being diagnostics and many other areas of building that whole ecosystem. I think that's what the government can do. And if it opens up, if it builds, and there's enough demand in the country, I think it will automatically spur innovation. The rest of it, I think, whether it's in terms of coming up with data and other things, will automatically come. But those are the things that at least can be done from a top-down approach.
Very interesting. I think if someone were to make notes, it is in terms of government spending on education as well as building human resources for the ecosystem of healthcare, and also streamlining the regulatory and infrastructure oriented issues. That's where only governments can do. So I think their focus is clear cut, as you have explained to us. Thank you very much, ma'am. How do you foresee, or how do you see evolve some of the behavioral changes adopted by corporates, say, for example, in terms of health and care in the workplace? We already see a lot of work from home versus work from office. I know that's a very obvious change. And from there, what kind of resources do you think these corporates would deploy to ensure that health is actually protected or is enhanced within the organizations? Some of them have designated wellness officers. Tech Mahindra has employed HR as wellness officers. Some others have a different designated other than HR as wellness officers. So what kind of trends do you see in the corporate behavior vis-a-vis health and care?
So I think one is that we will see more spend on prevention. And I think earlier, I think most corporates had, it's not that they didn't have. And I think you mentioned that there are wellness officers and all of that. But I think now, there'll be basically be a demand from the employee side as well. So one of the things I remember speaking to one of the large MNCs was that, it was, all this was there. There are wellness officers, there is a budget for that, but sometimes it's not utilized because people don't want to, don't feel the need to do it, right? And I think, one thing that the pandemic did was to sort of force people to think that that is a necessary thing. So there'll be more focus on prevention, and there'll be ways of, and when I mentioned earlier in terms of analytics and all of that, I think that would be helpful from a employees understanding perspective. We've seen some examples of that, but I think that will see a little bit more getting highlighted in the next years, in next coming years.
Oh, thank you, ma'am. I'll move from the
I do have another call that I had at 8 o'clock. So if we can.
We are more or less through, and I am done with the questions on trends. I'll hand it over to Professor Prasad to wrap it up and some of the questions that he has jotted down from the audience section, and then we can close it soon after that. Over to you, Professor Prasad.
Thanks a lot, ma'am, for sparing so much time. This last question is, is leveraging on the aspect of education that you mentioned. This phase is likely to impact the aspirations of students for education and from industry on the demand careers which are being offered. So what do you see as the opportunities and the issues here? This aggregates the question on that.
So I think I don't know if this has spurred more people to get into the medical profession or not, because I think it has been a tough year for the medical professionals. I know my nephew just finished his education. One niece is doing it. So I have quite a few people who are in the medical world, and I often ask them if they are, that's something that they're keen on doing. I think some of them are inspired to do something because I think the need for the doctors was felt the highest this year and not any other year. But at the same time, I think the amount of casualties and deaths within that community was also quite high, and I think that sort of can be a little bit not so great for people trying to go into that space. But 2-3 things I realized that because I had a nephew who was who lost 1.5 years in being able to do work from home. It's not so easy to do that when you're doing something like medicine. So I think one is to be able to come up with models that will allow medicine to be taught in ways that probably wasn't taught earlier. And I remember that there was one of my seniors who came up with a model of virtually training and doing these, potential, even surgeries and many other things online. If I think we'll start seeing more of that virtual education coming, where you can actually use AR, some form of augmented reality to help, because otherwise, you can only read textbooks, but that's not going to be enough from a medical profession. So one is to be able to increase some of that. The second is to be able to find ways that that students can become more involved in that process early on, rather than wait till they finish their PG or otherwise, so that you have more people who are sort of more familiar with patient and human interaction. And the third is to be able to get doctors to be a little bit understanding in terms of how do you speak in terms of empathy and counseling, because in the end I think the role, while we'll see a lot more new devices, new tools and techniques coming up from a medical, for a medical professional, what will be needed most will be that comfort that the doctor can provide. So I think bringing that tools in terms of how do you create that comfort between a patient and this thing is probably what is going to be much more needed in the future of education.
Thanks a lot, ma'am. I think, you have responded insightfully from a medical and a doctor perspective. I don't want to hold you back. You have given us far more time than we have asked for. So no, for that, there are many more questions, but for the time being, I'll hand it back to Mr. Sudhakar.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ms. Anu Acharya. On behalf of everybody at ICFAI Group, I would like to extend thanks to you for this enormously informative session that you have conducted over the last 1.5 hours. From technology to trends to investments to role of private to the role of public as well as the government. And more importantly, towards the end, you have mentioned how empathy can play a critical role in connecting all these resources to dealing with the patient. And that's a very, very big takeaway. Thank you very much for this 360-degree perspective that you have provided. It's highly useful. It's a masterclass that we have enjoyed. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you, Professor Prasad. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, everyone, for listening in. Thank you.
So I think to sum up from the session side, there are a few points I'd like to make. and to all the participants. See, essentially, as an institution, we am repeating this again that there are various ways of viewing this seminar, and we have viewed it from a entrepreneurial leadership, innovation, managerial lens. Because there's a lot to be done, just as in education, there's a lot to be done in healthcare. And the budget spent by the government are very low in both the sectors. So you will see more and more private participation coming in different ways. And so we are trying to see what we can do in order to develop the discussion. This was in essence what we have sought to achieve. I understand that there are a lot of very specific questions that have come in both when you filled up the form as well as in the chat box. You have seen the constraints, and no, to that extent we have been able to handle what we could best do. But let me leave a thought with you with respect to education and where ICFAI is good at. See, we have been working on healthcare management for now close to 4 years. And you can see that there is highly interdisciplinary. It's not just medicine. There's a huge amount of technology coming in now. You've got the the leadership dimensions, the behavioral dimensions, the communication dimensions, the psychological dimensions, the financial dimensions, and during the seminar you have seen how each of them is important. You can't materialize anything without with just the the idea of the medicine. You need to put all this together, and you have to see how you can put it across. So this is where the opportunity for potential managers, leaders, entrepreneurs will come from. And we have tried to put together a curriculum as well as a set of electives which focus on fostering this. I'd leave it at that, but I think this discussion can go on, and we'll come back to you with a lot of other themes on healthcare and management. Thanks, Sudhakar. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your questions, and thank you very much, Professor Prasad, for connecting the dots. I think in more ways than one, education and healthcare are interconnected, or they look similar at least, in terms of nurturing the patient or taking care of health, which is similar to taking care of education, which is a lifetime kind of investment. So as parallels, they have heavily invested resources that are demanded in both the sectors, and both of them are fundamental and core sectors where an interplay of various stakeholders is required right from the start to the advent of new technologies and the changing times, and especially during the most difficult times like this, both education and healthcare would have to come together and play a pivotal role in saving the society. So on this note, I would like to once again thank all of you for joining this webinar, and we would like to meet you on the next Friday with another guest and another interesting topic. Thanks on behalf of ICFAI, and do take care and stay safe. Bye.